Next, I want to introduce our next speaker. We actually have Phil Fersht speaking, and then he will be moderating a panel of buyers. So I'll introduce Phil and let him introduce the rest of the panelists. So Phil founded HFS Research in early 2010 and has overseen the growth and development of the organization to become a leading analyst authority and knowledge community for global business and organization. Fersht was named Analyst of the Year in 2011 by the Institute of Industry Analysts Relations, and got that award for 2 years in a row. And he's the author of a leading blog in the services industry that, if you guys have not subscribed to, you should. It's a very, very good blog in terms of sourcing, which has now entered its 6th year. He speaks regularly at many leading industry conferences, such as the Conference Board and NASSCOM, and he has been quoted by media in terms of Wall Street Journal, Business Week, and CIO magazine. So with that, I'd like to welcome Phil.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you. Thanks very much. There we go. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to Atlanta. My name's Phil, as you said, and really thank you for the introduction, and thanks for organizing this event and having the passion and energy to pull this together. It's a topic that some people in the industry don't want to talk about, but I think it's great that we've managed to get this conversation rolling, and so many of you have come today to fill the room, so I'm excited. So I'm going to talk briefly about some mega trends in the industry, because I think most of you come from elements around the sourcing business. And just before I start, can I just have a show of hands for who in the audience is a seller or a provider of sourcing services? Okay. And who in the audience buys sourcing services? Okay, so pretty good balance, about 60-40 sell to buy. That's very good. Well done. So I won't go too much into my background. I've been in the analyst and consulting business for 17 years. Worked a lot with offshoring. I worked at Deloitte Consulting, helping lead a lot of their finance and accounting, offshoring and outsourcing practices. And then went back to the research world with AMR Research. And when the company got bought by Gartner Group in end of 2009, we set up our own research firm, focus solely on business services and outsourcing. And we're an independent analyst firm. We have around 23 analysts globally. We're a growing team in Europe, and we're looking to invest in Asia Pac as well as our US offices. So does anyone know what the phrase horses for courses means? Okay, so back in the Victorian times in England, certain horses would actually run better on certain race courses. And so this expression, it's horses for courses, would come about because there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Certain things work better with certain outcomes. So someone once said to me, oh, outsourcing, it's horses for courses, mate. And I think what Ron was just talking about is absolutely clear. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to any of these issues we're talking about today, whether companies should outsource or not, whether work should take place in the US or not, what sorts of policies you can devise to incent companies to invest more in US versus India versus China, and these things as well. So I came up with this blog in 2007, and I thought, what the hell, call it horses for sources. I didn't realize I'd spend the next 6 years of my life having to explain what this means to an American audience. So, but goofy names kind of work, and it enabled us in 2010 to launch a serious research organization. And I spent the first year trying to persuade the world we weren't a blog, we were a proper research firm, and now we've really put a lot of research out to market. We've won various awards as an innovator and a leader in the outsourcing industry, and we give the likes of Gartner and Forrester a real run for their money when it comes to services and sourcing, and have a huge network of 130,000 subscribers. We have a sourcing executive council. In fact, I just saw a couple of members here today, and we meet twice a year to really get behind closed doors and try and figure out, how can we do this better? How can we partner better? How can we collaborate better? And how do we just get things moving? And This is a big market. I think Amrita pointed out earlier, but this is a market that's going to surpass $1 trillion by the end of the year. And you can see about 40% of it is in the BPO space, 60% of it is in the IT services space for outsourcing. And we're going to come up with some data on this. We decided yesterday to show how much of that, this is just expenditure on services. This isn't what companies are spending internally on their staff and their systems. How much of that spend is actually going to the US versus the rest of the world, but we think it's something probably around 20%. And so how can the US increase its share of this market as a domestic sourcing location? That's really getting into the numbers of how you can measure success as to what we're trying to do here. So we ran a big study early this year with KPMG, and we spoke to close to $400 billion plus enterprises to ask them what they were doing with their shared services and outsourcing strategies. And we asked them predominantly, how do you run each of these business processes and IT processes? And you can even see in things like payroll, for example, 40% of enterprises still run payroll in-house. More people run it in-house than outsource it. You would have thought in these days of ADP and Paychecks and companies like that, you know, who wants to do payroll anymore, right? Get down to areas like accounts receivable. 52% still run predominantly in-house. 1 in 5 run it in their shared service. When you think that 90% of these organizations have shared services, why do only 22% of them actually run their finance and accounting in the shared service? So companies are really struggling to let go of what they've actually running for their general and administrative processes. And it doesn't mean, oh wow, this market just has to explode, look at all this room for growth. There has to be a spark, there has to be a platform, there has to be a trigger to make this happen. This isn't all going to eventually be outsourced, but you can see that so much stuff is still run in-house. This is a very nascent industry with a very long way to go, so it's very timely to have this sort of conversation around domestic sourcing. So I really believe we're close to an inflection point, because most of the stuff that's been outsourced to date has been relatively low-end transactional administrative work. It can be maintenance, help desk around an application. It could be payables, receivables, healthcare claims, that sort of thing. And a lot of that work can move out to places like India, Philippines, Latin America, for example. What hasn't transpired is the mid to high level value work moving out to the outsourcers. And that's where I think the US has a big opportunity to step it up and take on their piece of the action. I was just checking with a couple of the local onshore providers yesterday, and I was surprised that, you know, they're picking up these small but high value projects with their clients. And this is a great industry. This industry is going to grow and grow and grow, and it might be lots and lots of small to mid-sized providers than great big mammoths like IBM just going in and taking the piece of the market. So this is a piece of data which we update every year, and it doesn't really change that much. But we asked all these 400 enterprises, how are your current outsourcing engagements faring? And where they're doing well is reducing costs. Look at this. Close to 9 out of 10 enterprises today are pretty happy or very happy with their cost reduction targets being met with outsourcing. Getting more effective globally, very, very good as well, close to 85%. Standardizing process, another 80% of companies are pretty happy with what they've achieved in terms of getting their processes in some sort of condition that they can outsource them, and they're saving their money, they're meeting their targets. So the outsourcing industry can give itself a pat on the back that it set out what it probably wanted to achieve in the first place, was let's get costs down and get stuff done adequately. Where outsourcing is not performing as well, kind of averagely, is in getting into these areas like getting access to capable talent, forcing change into business operations, transforming processes, things like that. And then where outsourcing is performing pretty badly, gaining access to analytics, providing innovation. Only 9% of companies feel that they're getting real movement with their innovation agendas when they outsource work. And part of the problem here is that companies are setting themselves up with procurement people, with administrative people, to basically manage a contract. They're not setting themselves up with talent to drive better ideas, better performance, things like that. And this is all the things that we have to talk about today as we look at what the US's role is in this whole equation. Another thing we asked, which I think is very telling, is we asked these people, what do you look for when you choose a service provider? Here we go, table stakes. So this is what you have to have just to get to the table. You've got to be financially viable. You've got to have knowledge of industry processes. That is absolutely critical. I mean, that's now a table stake. If you don't know about retail, you don't know about manufacturing, you shouldn't be bidding on companies in those industries. Having a track record to deliver your operations services effectively. So when you sign up with N-Star, whoever, for your electricity provision, do you ask them how many generators they have? Probably not, right? These are what we see as the real differentiators today across providers, and it's this talent that can take them beyond standard operations. It's absolutely critical. Culture of the provider's delivery organization. How can you support change management and governance needs? The one thing that kept popping up in my mind when Ron was speaking was this world needs change. It's the same old stuff being run by the same old people, just trying to shuffle things around and do things in a different way. What we need to do is change the way that we approach how we run our operations and approach our partnerships in a more smarter fashion. What I found really interesting here is things like, sorry, I'm actually gonna, if I can go back there 1 minute. Things like analytics and promoting gain share incentives, providing innovation, they're not absolutely critical to clients right now. They're nice to have. You know, hey, if you can give us some innovation, great. But what we really want is, we just want to get better than ordinary. And this is what I believe is one of the core issues with our industry right now is the marketeers are obsessed with all this stuff, when really clients are just saying, look, we just want to get beyond ordinary. We just want to start getting access to some better talent. We want to start making some progress with our processes, the way we approach things better, changing the mindset a bit of going from cost to value, that sort of thing. So I think as an industry, we need to slow down a bit and look at, we just need to get from A to B right now, not A to C. Okay. We also asked these companies, what are your key topics in 2013 that are critical or not so critical to your organization? And change management. 28% of enterprise buyers today see change management as mission critical when they look at outsourcing. In terms of altering this leadership mindset from cost to value creation, even more important in many respects. So this desire to change, this desire to shift the attitude of the enterprise leaders to get away from this cost reduction mindset is really important. And I think when Ron's talking about all these issues in the US, trying to get more competitive, trying to channel more labor into the sourcing engagements and things, we have to start thinking about things like this. How does the government, how do policy leaders, how do enterprise leaders, how do leading consultants, for example, help shift this mindset away from cost? I mean, we had a meeting with, I think, 50-odd buyers of outsourcing just a couple of months ago, and we asked, these are senior level folks who are running very complex deals, and we asked them, how many of your leaderships are obsessed with cost? And 72% said they were. So I think this obsession with cost is overriding the obsession with value. It's like this obsession with getting Martin Luther King's statue made overrode the desire to make it in America. So, in terms of what corporate leadership is looking to do, this was a study we ran late last year, talking to very senior level leaders of operations, and we asked them what their objectives were when they initiated their outsourcing. initiatives, and it was like things like gaining access to talent, driving cultural change, areas like that. And what you can see here, this is the shift. This is the shift in how the objectives changed since they started their engagement. So something like cost reduction, which is obviously very high on the list when they go into the engagement, that doesn't actually increase at all as a target once they've outsourced. It actually gets less important. The attention moves to how do we get better talent, how do we drive change, how do we improve compliance, and issues like this. So companies are going into these outsourcing deals. They're often bringing in a deal team to negotiate it. They're negotiating with an advisor. And then once the deal's done, that entire engagement is then offloaded to a completely different team to then run on both the buy side and the sell side. And everyone's trying to figure out what the hell was sold. And everyone's trying to operate to a contract that was set up purely for cost reduction purposes. So part of the thing that has to switch in the outsourcing industry is how do you change the discussions at the onset of these negotiations, not after the deal is done. And this is what we asked the buyers in terms of their talent, right? What sort of talent were they looking for when they actually kicked off their outsourcing engagement? And at the beginning, they were looking for people who could manage transitions, do SLA performance management, contract negotiation, manage financial business cases, lots of tactical things. We then asked them, how important are these talent attributes to your governance team today? So you've done your deal, you're now in mid-flow within your contract. Suddenly, improving analytics, people who can define business outcomes beyond cost, driving innovation. Suddenly, strategic objectives take over once the operational stuff is done. And here's the core issue. We look out to 2020. This is a McKinsey study that got a lot of attention, and you can actually see in 2020 in the US alone they're predicting 300,000 surplus of office workers in the United States, but 200,000 data scientists lacking every year in this country. So there's this big shift from people don't want the paper pushers, the widget turners. People are looking for how can they get more talent that is analytical, that can understand the changing world, that can take internal and external data and make sense of all this. So this is some of the great shifts that we're seeing underlying the movement in this industry. And then when we asked a whole selection of buyers, providers in this industry, how hard is it to source the talent you need? And you can see here, it's pretty easy for these folks to get contract negotiators, finding people who can manage transitions, even make financial business cases. But when it gets to we need to find governance executives who can influence executives, who can drive innovation, who can do benchmarking, who can improve our industry acumen, it's getting harder and harder and harder to find those people. And so ultimately, this is a talent situation happening. We are inundated with resumes at HFS every day from buyers saying, hey, I need to go out and find 5 people who can do sourcing analytics, procurement, FP&A, things like that. There's a real gaping need for talent on the buy side that I've never seen before. 5 years ago, I only got resumes from salespeople and marketing people and service providers. They were the ones chopping around. Now it's the buyers who are trying to skill up, get smarter at this, get more value out of this. So let's move to today's panelists. If gentlemen, if you'll come on up. Yeah. Exactly. I thought you'd be sitting here when I started, but. So maybe Gary, first to sit down, would you introduce yourself to the audience?
Gary Eppinger, can you hear me okay? Former CISO for Superval retail grocery store. Spent 20 years plus on the buy side. Spent time with GE, Rockwell Automation, on infrastructure, security, as well as application development and support. And happy to be here.
Thanks, Gary. Mike Heeter from Jostens.
Yeah, Mike Heeter. Can everybody hear me okay? Like Gary, I'm happy to be out of Minneapolis from the heat. It was 97 there yesterday, to Atlanta where it's a cool 88. I've been working for Jostens for over 15 years. Jostens is probably best known for class rings, yearbooks, and graduation products like diplomas, caps, and gowns. I did check, and we did manufacture the 1995 Atlanta Braves ring, so for all of those Braves fans here. But I've been... Monty, thank you. But I've been working on a web platform for Jostens for over 7 years now. We provide online yearbook creation tools to over 20,000 schools throughout North America. And we've actually used domestic sourcing off and on all 7 years. In the beginning, we had to find the talent ourselves. So it's kind of nice to have partners now that we can work with that help us do that. And we've done some offshoring and most recently been onshoring again the last 2 years.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tom Mirc, and I'm the manager of Global Product and Customer Systems at Red Hat. Many of you may be familiar with Red Hat and the Red Hat Enterprise Linux operating system. That's our flagship product. My team is responsible for the maintenance, development, and evolution of Red Hat's primary support portal, access.redhat.com. And I'm responsible for the release engineering, quality assurance, development support, and business analysis activities associated with the customer portal. My team, I have 17 on staff, and then we leverage several partners to provide multiple services in our organization.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to move to our next question, which is I'll put some data from, we ran this big study at the end of last year where we spoke with about 250 odd buyers of outsourcing services in the US, and these are billion-dollar-plus enterprises. And we asked them specifically around their attitudes towards different countries they were sourcing to, in particular the US. And the first thing we asked them was, which of these regions resonate in moving work to in the next 18 months? And we actually went through all the different applications and processes. And you can see here for non-voice, India still remains the region in greatest demand. So I want to throw this over to you guys. Maybe Mike, you can start this off. But how much do you leverage India in your business? And would you say it's increasing or decreasing in focus?
Yeah, we leveraged India heavily in the 90s when we were doing ERP upgrades and installations, and recently though we've been moving away from India. It used to be all about cost, and you'd be looking at the absolute dollar that you're spending per developer per resource. But what we were finding was that made the accountants happy, but when we were looking at the overall value, we realized in order to support that we had to have multiple on-site resources at a much higher cost, and when you blended all the rates together, we really weren't saving as much as we thought we were from a pure cost standpoint, and so it wasn't the value that we thought. And then you had these intangible costs that went with that, things like the communication barriers, the differences in time zones, just the drain on the staff on my team, and just the grind of working with these people on calls at 7 in the morning and 9 at night, and the drain on people's personal lives. So it didn't end up being the value that we thought it was.
Right. Okay, I can see you nodding there, Tom, and
Yeah, absolutely. We've had a very similar experience. Red Hat has built up a presence in Pune, India as our primary operations center, and we maintain a global support call center there. We tried to build up supporting IT functions within Pune, India, and primarily through cost motivation, and we ran into very similar challenges. We started to see on a pure basis the economics were very favorable, but as you look at the associated support and coordination functions and project management costs that were associated with that Pune investment, it has turned out to be unfavorable from a cost perspective. So we have actually started very aggressively pursuing domestic sourcing options to counter that strategy.
Okay, good, Tom. So I'm going to save this. This is the spicy question we have. I'll save this one for you, Gary. But we asked the enterprises to rate the performance of US staff versus non-US staff across these various facets. So you can see here we have good cultural understanding and communication skills. Clearly the US staff really did beat them out there. Value for money, about the same. Expensive, US staff, a lot more expensive than non-US. Understands my business, US staff, significantly better. Takes initiative, US staff, better. Hardworking, about the same. So, might surprise some people. And being innovative, again, US workers are outperforming non-US workers in sourcing situations quite aggressively. So, Gary, would you agree with this from your own experiences?
Yeah, you know, I actually would agree with some of the data that you have in front of us. One of the things that I've seen is, and again, back to an earlier comment around, you know, how do you take your processes and commoditize them, right? So if there's truly commodity work or very procedure-driven work, then it may align well from an outsourcing perspective. So therefore, you'll see more of an even playing field. But as you get closer to the business, as you get closer to the things that's important, to running your business, those becomes where your uniqueness come in place. You know, if I think about from a perspective I've seen at Superval, and one of the areas that I also owned was the pharmacy space, and we did a huge outsourcing relationship in India. In fact, we started off, had our own company, there in India with about 1,000 resources. We eventually ended up selling it to a bigger provider. But one of the things that we constantly got challenged from a development and support perspective in the pharmacy space is that the pharmacy industry or the pharmacy is very dramatically different in India than the U.S. Highly regulated here, unregulated there, right? You can walk into any corner store and get whatever drugs just about you need legally. And so the translation of our go-to-market strategy, our translation of how we ran our business was dramatically impacted on their capabilities to provide those services because it was dramatically different. So we had to actually educate them, go through training sessions, to bring them up to the speed of what was common knowledge here in the U.S.
Okay. So would you say in terms of value for money, it kind of evened out at the end, or?
The other thing is, as we kind of look at a total TCO around the cost, right? As Tom and Mike's kind of talking about, it's not just the dollar amount of a programmer to a programmer. You got to look at the total TCO and how much time does it take to get the same quality of work done. Does it have to be touched 3 times, right? And then you have the if it's going overseas and you got to wait, in between, the next day, to kind of get us response back, and it takes 3 times as long. So all of that factors into the total cost. So your initial, as your initial stats that came in, where people go into the relationship and the thought process, it was all around cost. You learn what the true TCO cost is after you're into it, and then you kind of change what your criteria is that you may want to look at. Interesting.
I see you, Mike. So how do you change the mindset from cost to more value? Is this something you've been through in your company?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when we were in India, I mentioned that the value wasn't there just from a pure financials when you actually ran all of the numbers. But the other thing we were seeing was from a product knowledge standpoint, people in the U.S. are familiar with our products. They know what a class ring is. They know what a yearbook is. They've been through a yearbook signing probably if they bought one. When we took that offshore, we had to explain things that just didn't even dawn on us that these people wouldn't understand, and so those cultural barriers were really a big hurdle for us, and so it took us a while to sort of work through that. And we kind of realized that we just weren't really that good at offshoring yet. We were a medium-sized company. My team was about 30 people at that time, but we just didn't know how to run those meetings, and so we realized we needed to step back and look at how could we be more productive and more effective at managing remote work teams regardless of where they were. And so we decided to step back and think about doing it in the US as a way to at least practice and get better at it, where we could eliminate some of those other issues, some of the time zone and
Right.
cultural issues and get better at running those meetings.
Interesting. Tom, is this something that you can do with your existing team, or do you need to bring in new talent to help you, do you find?
It's an interesting question. I think we have somewhat of a unique perspective at Red Hat. We are fully in a growth phase. Incremental revenue is growing between 15 and 20% year over year. And so cost, well, it's an influencing factor in decision making. It's not necessarily a primary factor. We have 3 use cases right now that we're dealing with when we look at our staffing strategy and the role of domestic sourcing within that. The first is capability-based sourcing. That's where we don't have the existing capability. We are running into challenges acquiring that skill set in the local market, and therefore we look to a service provider to provide that externally. The second is burst-based or project-oriented staffing, and that's where we have a specific project with a defined end, and we bring in resources who we think can act as a catalyst to expedite that project. And the third is that cost use case. We want to bring down the overall level of cost associated with that function. So as we look at those 3 use cases, there is definitely a role for India, there's definitely a role for Europe, Eastern Europe particularly, in application maintenance type tasks. What we view as commodity development will most likely stay offshore. But as we look at that capability-based use case, we are absolutely looking outside of the company to bring that in. The reality is we are trying to service a rapidly growing business, and it's very difficult to cultivate the talent or even obtain the talent in the regional market. So that's where we turn to that capability-based provider, and we have found tremendous success with that model.
Right, and in terms of sourcing local talent, maybe Gary, what have you done in the past? Do you find it's easier to go to these local providers, or do you go to like a recruitment shop? How do you do it?
Yeah, it's actually pretty tough.
Right.
And depending on the right skill set that you're trying to do. So we try to use a combination of all, right? So we do a lot of local recruiting. We do a lot of recruiting through executive, targeted firms that we've had success with. We leverage our partners, right? So if that's a consulting partner, an integrator to grab talent, we get a chance to try them before you buy them. So we've kind of done that, as well as having a pretty strong presence across the U.S. with 3 or actually 4 big centers: Salt Lake City, Minneapolis, Chicago, and then also in California. So that kind of helps bridges, from a location perspective. But it's tough.
Okay. Mike, you wanted to add to that in terms of sourcing local talent?
Yeah, we do work a lot with local firms, and we look for a certain type of local firm. We look for a smaller firm because we're looking for maybe staff augmentation to the tune of 20 to 30 people at a time. So we try to work with smaller Minneapolis-based firms that are really aware of the talent that's in Minneapolis and are aware of the different requirements that we have. And when we're looking for outsourcing providers, we want the same thing. We want smaller providers. Jostens isn't as large as either Red Hat or Superval, so we're looking for people that will treat us like we're one of their biggest clients, and we'll maybe partner with them to find resources in Bulgaria for mobile development, for example, or for with still a Minneapolis presence, I guess, to help manage that. So it's kind of a blended thing that we do.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Tom, what about that?
We leverage a network of 6 approved staffing providers, and our primary office, our headquarters, is Raleigh, North Carolina. Raleigh is a metro area of about 2 million when you extend it through Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill. Great talent, great academic environment, a lot of good universities there for sourcing talent. What we're finding is that the traditional staffing model, where it's viewed through get a body in the door, view it as a commodity, the game's over on that. The types of challenges that our business customers are facing, us as IT serving to our business customers, are now, and they need response to those business issues immediately. They can't wait because of a lack of ability to find talent in the local market. So that's the most compelling motivation. One area that we found particularly successful moving towards was, as we looked at quality engineering, the type of work that we're doing and the type of QA personnel that we had weren't necessarily strategic and couldn't get us to the next level. And so that's where we reached out with a capability motivation to a strategic third-party provider and found great success, and that provider was Expansion.
Thanks, Tom. So let's talk about what it would take to move work to different countries. And here we asked these 200 plus enterprises, based on their current costs and experience and quality of services that they're receiving, what levels of cost savings would they need to achieve to go into a certain country? And you can see that to go to China, people want 28%. Philippines, they want to make a 29% saving. India, 28, people want to save 28%. That's sort of getting lower. In the old days, it used to be we need to save 40% and 30%. And in the US, people will move work to US locations if they can save 17%. Now, this is interesting math. I don't know how much it makes sense in reality if someone gave you a little menu of services, but I mean, if you were looking at cost of work, is that kind of roughly how you'd look at it, Mike?
Well, we're actually, with the U.S. Sourcing that we're doing, we're probably saving closer to 30%.
Right.
And I think that's kind of what we need to even consider moving it out of our local offices for the type of work that we're doing. We have a lot of agile development teams, and in agile teams we've got short turns, 2-week sprints, lots of releases, a lot of communication required. And so to make up for that cost, when you start working with a remote firm, you need to have good savings there. But like Tom said, QA was a great area for us to get started with. We didn't have a great QA practice internally, and so for us to be able to partner with somebody to do that domestically was great, and to get that 30% savings. I don't think we would go to India for 28% savings when we're getting 30% domestically. And I'm talking about contract rates. Obviously, when I start talking about full-time employees, it's a little bit different math. But that's what we're seeing and taking advantage of.
But are you saving 30% in hard numbers, just literally taking the staff is less expensive that you're sourcing, or you just need less staff when you use a third party?
Same numbers. So if I need 2 quality analysts and I pay a certain rate in Minneapolis, I'll probably pay 30% less than if I do it domestically through a rural firm like RSI.
Right, it's interesting. What's your experience with that, Tom?
Well, from a cost perspective, so we've started disassociating application maintenance activities from innovation activities and supporting business objectives. So what we actually look at from a domestic sourcing model is the benefit. We actually view it as subsidized innovation. So when you reach out to a vendor who has deep capability in one functional area, they can actually facilitate that innovation. And because of the favorable economics of the rural model or the domestic model, we're finding that we can obtain that innovation at a lower cost relative to cultivating that talent internally or investing in our local market. So we see it as subsidized, a favorable economics towards subsidized innovation, to encapsulate it.
Okay. So Gary, do you feel when you're sourcing domestically that the staff you're getting are part of your team? Do you feel that, or do you still feel there's more of a master-slave type model? We say you do type thing.
And Monty's in a room now, he can tell me.
A lot of open source projects as Red Hat, and there's one project that would be associated with our JBoss line. So we had there's a developer, very prolific developer, who contributed substantially to this project, and it was open source. We wanted to productize this product, so we wanted to hire the open source contributor. He had contributed over 2 years, extremely prolific. We reached out to him, and it turned out he was a 16-year-old from India who couldn't necessarily be employed. So but was absolutely integral to that project. So it kind of illustrates that global doors are wide open, and it is a meritocracy.
Great. So I think we've got time for maybe one more question from the audience. Right at the back there, Mr. Kublanov. You'll be hearing more from this guy later.
So a question for you. So to what extent are changes and adjustments in the regulatory situation, particularly immigration reform, causing you guys to think about essentially your sourcing portfolio, right, and potentially hedging against what may be coming down the road? How much of a concern is it for you, and what steps are you taking in that regard?
You know, I would say it's a concern, but it's not a big concern, right? Because we put it out on the outsourcers to figure it out, right? We need resources. If you can't get them, then your competitor will. So they have to make sure that they have their visas in place. They need to make sure they have the right penetration of onshore, offshore, nearshore. You know, for the right balance that we may need. So we give them as much leeway as we can from a demand perspective, but we push more of it onto them. But we absolutely see and are impacted, right, with the reduction of the H-1B visas and the time it takes to get folks onshore.
Great. Well, Tom Mirc from Red Hat, Mike Heeter from Jostens, and Gary Eppinger from Superval. Great contributions. Thank you very much.